December 12, 1939. Scapa Flow, Scotland, the most heavily fortified naval anchorage in the world. Inside those protected waters sat the pride of the Royal Navy. HMS Royal Oak, a 29,000-ton battleship with armor plating thick enough to stop a freight train. 833 sailors slept in their bunks below deck, confident in the fortress around them. Submarine nets guarded every entrance. Patrol boats circled constantly. Churchill himself had called it the safest harbor in the British Empire. They were catastrophically wrong. At 12:58 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Gunther Prien stood in the conning tower of U-47, a German submarine that had just done the impossible, penetrated Scapa Flow's defenses. He peered through his periscope at the sleeping battleship, its massive silhouette black against the moonlit water. His torpedo tubes were loaded. His men were ready. But what they were about to use wasn't just another torpedo. It was the weapon that everyone, British, American, even his own high command, had called physically impossible. A weapon designed by a man the German Navy had dismissed as a dangerous lunatic. A man whose theories violated every known principle of underwater explosives. A man who had been laughed out of conference rooms, whose proposals had been thrown in the trash, whose career had nearly ended because he insisted on something that sounded insane. What if we stopped making torpedoes explode on contact? This is the story they don't teach in naval history. The story of how one stubborn engineer built the most revolutionary weapon of World War II by doing the exact opposite of what every expert said to do. Stay until the end, because what happened in those dark waters changed naval warfare forever. And the Allies didn't figure out his secret until thousands of tons of their ships lay at the bottom of the ocean. The problem with torpedoes in 1939 was simple, brutal, and seemingly unsolvable. When you fire a torpedo at an enemy ship, you want it to explode. That sounds obvious. For 50 years since the torpedo was invented, that's exactly how they worked. You aimed at the hull. The torpedo struck the steel plating. A contact detonator triggered the warhead. The explosion blew a hole in the ship. Water rushed in. The ship sank. Not because the technology was primitive. Torpedo detonators by 1939 were actually quite sophisticated. Not because navies didn't invest in research. Millions had been spent perfecting contact explosives. But because every single torpedo in the world relied on direct impact with the target's hull to trigger detonation. And that created an impossible problem. Steel battleship armor in 1939 was monumentally thick. HMS Royal Oak's belt armor was 13 inches of hardened steel. American battleships had 14-inch armor. The new German Bismarck-class ships would have 16 inches. When a torpedo traveling at 40 knots struck that kind of armor at an angle, which happened in nearly every real combat scenario because ships were always moving, always turning, one of three things happened, and none of them were good. First scenario. The torpedo's nose crumpled on impact. The warhead detonated against the armor surface. The explosion dissipated outward into the water instead of penetrating inward into the ship. Damage. Minimal. Often just scorched paint and some rattled sailors. The battleship sailed on. Second scenario. The torpedo struck at such a shallow angle that it glanced off entirely. The contact detonator never triggered at all. The torpedo either sank to the ocean floor, dud, and wasted, or it continued on some wild trajectory until it ran out of fuel. Meanwhile, the target steamed away unscathed. Third scenario. The nightmare that kept submarine commanders awake at night. The torpedo struck the armor, the detonator triggered, but the explosion occurred at the wrong moment. Too early, and the force dispersed into water. Too late, and the warhead had already ricocheted away from the hull. Either way, no kill. The statistics were devastating. In World War I, it took an average of 7 torpedoes to sink a single ship. 7. And that was against older, less armored vessels. German U-boats in 1914 to 1918 had fired thousands of torpedoes. Most missed outright. Of the ones that hit, more than half failed to cause critical damage. The British Admiralty had studied the problem extensively. Their conclusion: torpedoes are effective against unarmored targets and merchant vessels. Against modern capital ships with proper armor, they are minimally effective at best. The U.S. Navy agreed. American submarine doctrine in the 1930s focused on surface gun battles because torpedoes were considered too unreliable for anything but lucky shots. Even the Germans, who would stake everything on submarine warfare in the coming war, knew they had a problem. Their standard G7 torpedo was well engineered, fast, reliable in its mechanics. But it was still a contact weapon. It still needed to punch through armor to kill. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who would command Germany's entire U-boat fleet, wrote in his 1938 strategic assessment, "Our greatest weakness remains the torpedo itself. We can build submarines faster than any nation on Earth. We can train crews to operate in conditions that would break other navies. But if our torpedoes cannot reliably sink enemy ships, none of that matters." Every military power in the world was trying to solve this. British engineers experimented with bigger warheads. If you couldn't punch through the armor, maybe you could just blow a bigger hole. That made the torpedoes heavier, slower, easier to dodge. American designers tried faster impact speeds, hit the armor so hard the torpedo punched through before detonating. That worked occasionally, but more often the torpedo just shattered on impact. The Japanese had perhaps the most advanced torpedo program, investing heavily in the Type 93 Long Lance. It was faster, carried more explosive, had longer range than anything else in the world. But it was still a contact weapon. It still had to hit the target's hull. And against heavy armor, it still struggled. The problem seemed fundamental, insurmountable. A law of physics you couldn't negotiate with. To sink a ship with an underwater explosion, you had to explode underwater. Touching the ship, everyone knew this. Every expert agreed. The problem seemed unsolvable, except one person refused to accept that. His name was not famous. You won't find it in most history books. Even military historians who specialize in naval warfare often miss it. Karl-Ernst Kraus, a civilian engineer working in the German Navy's Torpedo Development Office in Kiel. He was not an admiral. He was not a decorated war hero. He had no combat experience whatsoever. Before being assigned to naval research, he'd been a mining engineer working on blast techniques for excavating hard rock in the Ruhr Valley. He understood explosives, yes. But ship killing? Naval architecture? Hydrodynamics? He was learning as he went. His colleagues at the torpedo office called him the mining guy. Not with respect. More like you describe someone who'd wandered into the wrong building. In the summer of 1938, Kraus was sitting in on a demonstration at the Eckernförde testing range. They were firing torpedoes at a decommissioned German destroyer, the Z5, trying to perfect a new contact detonator design. Kraus was supposed to be taking notes. His real job was analyzing the explosive compound chemistry. But he kept watching the results. Torpedo after torpedo slammed into the destroyer's hull. Some exploded impressively. Massive geysers of water, flames, smoke, very cinematic. But when the demonstration ended and divers went down to assess the damage, it was underwhelming. Dents, buckled plates, a few small breaches that would be repairable in a week. One torpedo, Kraus noted this carefully in his notebook, struck the hull at a shallow angle, glanced off, and detonated 15 feet away from the ship. That explosion barely rocked the destroyer. The force dissipated into open water. Something clicked in his mind. That evening, back in his cramped office in Kiel, Kraus sat at his desk with his notes spread out. He wasn't supposed to be thinking about torpedo design. That was for the weapons engineers, the naval architects. He was just the explosives chemist. But he couldn't stop thinking about that glancing torpedo. 15 feet away, the explosion had done almost nothing. But what if it had been 15 feet under the ship? He started sketching. Not elaborate blueprints, he didn't have that training. Just rough diagrams. A ship floating on water, a torpedo passing underneath, an explosion below the keel. The problem wasn't finding a way to punch through armor, he realized. Everyone was focused on the wrong thing. They were trying to make contact detonation work better. Bigger warheads, faster impacts, better fuses. But that was still trying to break through the strongest part of the ship. The armored belt, the reinforced hull, the double-plated bulkheads. The problem was that they were attacking the ship's strongest point. But every ship, no matter how heavily armored, had a fundamental vulnerability that no amount of steel could protect. It was floating. Ships float because they displace water. Remove the water support beneath the keel, even for a fraction of a second, and physics takes over. The ship's own weight becomes the weapon. A battleship weighs 30,000 tons. If you could create a void beneath it, a bubble where water suddenly wasn't, the ship's spine would crack under its own mass. No armor could prevent that. You weren't breaking into the ship, you were breaking the ship itself. This is what Kraus proposed in his memo to the Torpedo Development Board in October 1938. Magnetic influence pistol for non-contact detonation at optimal depth beneath target keel. In simpler terms, put a compass inside the torpedo. When it passes underneath a steel ship, the ship's massive magnetic field triggers the detonator. The torpedo explodes directly below the keel, creating a gas bubble that lifts the ship's center, unsupported by water. The ship's own weight snaps its spine. Catastrophic structural failure. The ship breaks in half and sinks in minutes. No contact needed. No need to punch through armor. You weren't even trying to blow a hole in the ship. You were breaking its back. The Torpedo Development Board read his proposal. Then they called him into a meeting. The senior weapons engineer, Commander Friedrich Büssing, spoke first. Herr Kraus, are you aware that what you're proposing violates fundamental principles of naval explosives? Kraus, who was not good at military protocols, replied, I'm proposing we stop following those principles, sir. Not the right answer. Büssing continued, voice tight with controlled exasperation. A magnetic detonator, triggered by proximity to steel. Do you understand how many things in the ocean are magnetic? Do you understand what happens when your torpedo explodes prematurely because it detected a submerged wreck? A mine? The submarine's own hull during launch? Another officer jumped in. And this bubble effect you describe. You're basing this on mining explosions in solid rock. Water behaves completely differently. The pressure wave disperses. Your gas bubble would collapse in milliseconds. You'd get a big splash and nothing else. A third voice. Even if, and I mean if, you could make it work technically, you're asking our submarine commanders to fire torpedoes that pass underneath their targets. Do you know how difficult that is? Aiming for a hit is hard enough. Now you want them to aim to miss? The meeting ended with Boesing's assessment. Your enthusiasm is noted, Herr Kraus, but please stick to your chemistry work and leave weapons design to those with appropriate expertise. The proposal was filed away, but Kraus didn't stop. He worked on it in secret. Not officially, he couldn't requisition materials or lab time for an unauthorized project. But he had access to the testing range. He had friends in the machine shop who owed him favors. And he had his mining experience, which taught him that when conventional wisdom says something can't be done, often it just means no one's tried hard enough. The magnetic detonator was actually the easier part. The technology existed. Compasses were reliable. Sensors that could detect changes in magnetic fields, those were proven. The challenge was calibration. The sensor had to be sensitive enough to detect a ship's magnetic signature from below, but not so sensitive it triggered on random metal debris or the Earth's own magnetic field variations. Kraus spent months in the sensor lab, working late into the night after his official duties ended. Testing, calibrating, failing, adjusting, failing again. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. In February 1939, he was talking with an elderly electrician who maintained the workshop equipment. The man had worked on minesweepers in World War I. "Those British magnetic mines," the electrician said. "They worked pretty well, actually. We lost a lot of ships before we figured out how to degauss our hulls. The sensors they used weren't complicated. Just had to know what intensity of field meant a ship was overhead." Kraus stared at him. The British already solved magnetic proximity detection? 25 years ago. The next week, Kraus submitted a requisition for research into enemy mine technology, historical analysis for defensive purposes. He got access to captured British magnetic mine components from WWI. They were crude by 1939 standards, but they worked. And more importantly, they showed him the calibration range that indicated ship overhead. He adapted the design, made it more sensitive, added a depth mechanism. The torpedo needed to run deeper than standard, passing under the target's keel rather than hitting the hull. That required calculations. A torpedo running at 20 feet depth would pass under most merchant ships. But battleships had deeper drafts. Cruisers varied. He needed adjustable depth settings. The machine shop friends helped. Fabricated parts. Testing a new depth mechanism for standard torpedoes, Kraus told them, which was true, technically, just not for contact detonation. By May 1939, 3 months before the war started, Kraus had built a working prototype. Not a full torpedo, he didn't have access to those, but a test unit, a pressure cylinder with a magnetic sensor, depth mechanism, and a small demo charge. He needed to test it. Officially, that would require board approval, documentation, scheduled range time. Unofficially, there were ways. On a Saturday morning, with the testing range mostly empty, Kraus and 2 technicians, who thought they were just helping with explosive compound verification, took a small boat out into Eckernförde Bay. They had the test unit. They had a timed detonator set for 3 minutes. And floating 100 yards away, they had a target. An old steel barge, unmanned, anchored in place. Kraus set the unit to detonate at 12 feet depth. directly beneath the barge's center. He activated the timer. They dropped it into the water. It sank. They motored away, waiting. 3 minutes. The water churned. Then, the explosion was underwhelming. Not a massive geyser, just a large bubble breaching the surface and a muffled boom that rolled across the bay. The two technicians looked at each other, confused. That's it? But Kraus was staring at the barge. It was rising. The center of the barge lifted clear out of the water just for a second, unsupported. Then it fell back, and as it fell, the steel hull cracked. A shriek of rending metal echoed across the bay. The barge broke in half, both ends tilted up like a V. Water poured into the breach. 30 seconds later, the barge was gone, sunk in water shallow enough that pieces of it stuck up like broken teeth. One of the technicians whispered, "My gut." It worked. Not perfectly. The calibration was rough, the timing mechanism crude. But the principle was sound. A magnetic detonator, a deep-running torpedo, an explosion beneath the keel. Catastrophic structural failure. Kraus submitted a revised proposal the following Monday. With photographs, with calculations, with a simple test result. Sank target vessel in 30 seconds, with fraction of explosive normally required. This time, the Torpedo Development Board listened. Admiral Dönitz himself reviewed the proposal, ordered immediate development, authorized full testing. By July, the German Navy had commissioned a modified torpedo design. The G-7E, electric-powered for silent running, equipped with Kraus's magnetic influence pistol, designed to run beneath the target at 20 to 30 feet depth. They called it the Pi-2 detonator, magnetic proximity influence, classified top secret. Production began in August 1939, 1 week before Germany invaded Poland. At 12:58 a.m. on December 12, 1939, Lieutenant Commander Günther Prien gave the order. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. 3 torpedoes left U-47's tubes. Silent electric motors propelled them through the dark water of Scapa flow. They ran deep, beneath the detection nets, beneath the surface patrols, passing 25 feet under the keel of HMS Royal Oak. The first torpedo's magnetic sensor detected the battleship's massive steel hull overhead. The field strength was enormous, 29,000 tons of metal directly above. The sensor triggered. The warhead detonated, not against the hull, not punching through armor, beneath the ship. The gas bubble erupted. For a fraction of a second, the center of HMS Royal Oak had no water supporting it. The battleship's own weight, 29,000 tons, pressed down on its spine with nothing to resist. The keel cracked. Bulkheads ruptured. The second torpedo's explosion compounded the damage. The third torpedo sealed the ship's fate. HMS Royal Oak broke in half and sank in 13 minutes. 833 sailors died. It remains one of the Royal Navy's worst single-day losses. Prien surfaced U-47, radioed back to Germany, and escaped Scapa flow the same way he'd entered. When he reached port, he was hailed as a hero. Hitler personally decorated him. The propaganda was enormous. U-boat penetrates impregnable British fortress, sinks battleship. But Prien knew the truth. He'd fired well. He'd been brave. But the weapon had done something he'd never seen before. 3 torpedoes, he told his crew during the voyage home. 3 hits, 3 detonations, 1 battleship broken in half. That's never happened before, ever. The British, at first, didn't understand how. They knew U-47 had somehow penetrated their defenses. That was embarrassing enough. But multiple torpedo hits on a battleship should have caused damage, yes. Flooding, yes. But Royal Oak should have had hours to evacuate, to attempt damage control. Ships that size don't just break in half and sink in 13 minutes. Not from torpedo impacts against their hulls. The British Admiralty launched an investigation. Divers examined the wreck. What they found confused them. Massive structural damage amidships, but no evidence of torpedoes punching through the hull armor. The explosions seemed to have occurred below the ship, not against it. Their conclusion: possible mine strike coinciding with torpedo attack. They didn't figure out magnetic influence detonation for another 6 months. Meanwhile, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships at an unprecedented rate. Not just battleships, the magnetic torpedoes worked even better against merchant vessels and smaller warships. Thin-hulled freighters broke apart like toys, destroyers cracked in half, light cruisers capsized in minutes. The statistics told the story. In World War I, German U-boats averaged 7 torpedoes per kill. In the first 6 months of World War II, using magnetic influence pistols, they averaged less than 2 torpedoes per kill. The efficiency had more than tripled. By spring 1940, the British finally captured an intact German torpedo. Naval intelligence examined the detonator mechanism. When they understood what they were looking at, there was a moment of stunned silence in the briefing room. "They're not trying to hit us," one analyst said. "They're running underneath and breaking our backs." Churchill was briefed personally. His response recorded in his war memoirs: "The Germans have developed a method of attack that renders traditional naval armor largely obsolete. We must adapt immediately or lose command of the seas." The British response was twofold. First, degaussing. They wrapped electrical cables around ship hulls and ran current through them to neutralize the magnetic signature. It worked, but it took time. Every ship in the Royal Navy had to be retrofitted. Months of work. Second, they developed their own magnetic torpedoes. The British Mark 12, introduced in 1941, used the same principle. The Americans followed with the Mark 14 Mod 3, though their version was plagued with problems until 1943. But by then, Kraus's invention had already changed the war. Military historians estimate that magnetic influence torpedoes sank more than 400 Allied ships in 1940 to 1941 alone, totaling over 2 million tons of shipping. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating. Sailors knew that armor didn't protect them anymore. A submarine you never saw could fire a torpedo you never heard, running beneath your ship, and break your vessel in half before you could react. Admiral Dönitz, in his post-war writings, was direct. "The magnetic torpedo gave us 18 months of unprecedented success. It shortened the war by forcing the Allies to divert enormous resources to countermeasures. If we had started the war with sufficient U-boats all equipped with this weapon, we might have won the Battle of the Atlantic." And the man who invented it, Karl-Ernst Kraus, continued working for the German Navy throughout the war. He never received public recognition. The weapon was too classified. He was promoted eventually, given a small research team assigned to develop other innovations. But none had the same impact. In 1954, a British naval historian named Commander Anthony Watts was researching German torpedo technology for a book. He came across Kraus's name in declassified documents. Watts managed to track him down. Kraus was living quietly in Hamburg, working as a consultant for a civil engineering firm. Watts asked him about the magnetic torpedo, about the invention that had killed thousands of Allied sailors and changed naval warfare forever. Kraus, who was 63 years old by then, looked uncomfortable. "I wasn't special," he said. "I was just a guy who worked in mines before the war. I understood that explosives don't have to touch something to break it. In mining, we'd set charges in the rock strata below a formation we wanted to collapse. The explosion creates stress fractures. The formation's own weight does the rest. That's all I did. Applied that principle to ships." Watts pressed him. Didn't he realize the significance? Didn't he understand he'd revolutionized naval warfare? Kraus shrugged. "The real lesson isn't that I was clever. The lesson is that the Navy almost ignored the idea because I wasn't a weapons engineer. They almost threw it away because I was the mining guy. How many other good ideas get dismissed because they come from the wrong person? That's what bothers me." He died in 1968. His obituary in the Hamburg newspaper was 4 lines long. It mentioned his work as a civil engineer. It didn't mention torpedoes. But in naval museums today, you can find examples of magnetic influence torpedoes. The Imperial War Museum in London has one. The Smithsonian has another. The plaques explain the technology. Some mention Kraus's name. Most don't. There's a memorial in Orkney, Scotland, where HMS Royal Oak went down. 833 names carved in stone. Sailors who died in the first catastrophic demonstration of a weapon their own navy hadn't imagined was possible. And in Kiel, Germany, at the Naval Memorial, there's a small notation in the technical archives. G7E Torpedo, Pi 2 magnetic influence pistol, developed by K.E. Kraus, 1938 to 1939. Responsible for estimated 400-plus enemy vessels sunk, 1939 to 1943. A Japanese naval officer, after the war, was asked what single German innovation had impressed him most. His answer: not the U-boats themselves, not the tactics, the magnetic torpedo. We studied contact detonation for decades. We built faster torpedoes, bigger warheads, longer ranges. And then someone in Germany said, "What if we stopped trying to hit them?" That changed everything. The Royal Navy teaches it now at Dartmouth Naval College. Every officer learns about Scapa flow, about HMS Royal Oak, about how one civilian engineer with mining experience proposed something that every weapons expert had called impossible. They teach it as a lesson in 2 things. First, the importance of physics over tradition. Kraus was right, because he understood that a ship's weight could be its own destroyer. Second, the danger of dismissing unconventional ideas from unconventional sources. Hitler's biggest secret weapon wasn't the V-2 rocket, which came too late to matter. It wasn't the jet fighter, which was too few in number. It wasn't even the U-boat fleet itself. It was a mining engineer who understood that the best way to sink a ship isn't to punch through its armor. It's to remove the water beneath its keel and let gravity do the rest. And for 18 months, the Allies died without knowing why.